The dust of the Chihuahuan desert carries whispers of desperation, but for Eliana Brooks, it was about to carry a man named Barrett Steele. He wasn't a savior, nor was he a devil, but something far more dangerous, a debt collector with a conscience. He rode to her failing ranch, Whispering Creek, with the legal power to strip her of everything her late husband had died for. But what he offered, instead of ruin, was a contract of a different kind, a cold, calculated proposal of marriage. This is the story of how a debt of coin became a bond of souls, a tale of two strangers tied together by desperation, who would have to face down the most ruthless cattle baron in Texas, Dorian West, to discover if their paper-thin alliance could ever become a love as unbreakable as the land itself. The sun was a merciless hammer over the Texas flatlands in the summer of 1883. It beat down on the cracked earth on the thirsty sagebrush and on the weathered bones of the small ranch known as Whispering Creek. From her porch, Eliana Brooks watched the dust devil dance in the distance. It was a harbinger, a swirling ghost on the horizon that resolved itself slowly into the shape of a man on a horse. She wasn't expecting company. Since her husband Thomas had passed a year prior, in a tragic rockslide, visitors were rare and usually brought bad news. She felt the familiar knot tighten in her stomach, her hand calloused from mending fences and hauling water. Unconsciously, went to the worn handle of the Winchester rifle, leaning just inside the doorway. The rider moved with a steady, unhurried pace that spoke of a man who was neither lost nor in a hurry to be found. As he drew closer, details sharpened. He was tall in the saddle, his frame lean but broad at the shoulders. A low-brimmed, dust-caked hat shadowed his face, but she could see the set of a square jaw covered in dark stubble. His horse, a powerful buckskin, looked as resilient as its owner. He pulled up, not at the horse trough, but 10 yards from the porch, a respectful distance that was somehow more unnerving than overt aggression. He dismounted in a single fluid motion. The squeak of leather and the jingle of his spurs were the only sounds that dared challenge the ever-present wind. He took off his hat, slapping it against his thigh to knock off a layer of ochre dust. His hair was dark, sweat-plastered to his forehead. His eyes, the color of slate grey, met hers, and they held no warmth, only a weary assessment. "Ma'am," he said, his voice, a low baritone raspy from the trail, "I'm looking for the owner of the Brooks property." "You've found her." Eliana replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. She did not move from the doorway, her body a silent barricade to her home. "State your business." The man nodded slowly, his gaze sweeping over the ranch, the sagging porch rail, the barn that listed slightly to the west, the small herd of scrawny cattle huddled in the shade of a lone cottonwood. He saw everything she tried so hard to hold together with grit and prayer. "My name is Barrett Steele," he said, finally looking back at her. "I ride for Mr. Dorian West." The name landed like a physical blow. Dorian West. A name whispered with fear and resentment across 3 counties. He was a cattle baron whose ranch, the West Bullion, swallowed smaller homesteads like a python swallows rabbits. He owned the bank in Redemption Gulch, held the mortgages of half the folks in the territory, and had a private army of riders who enforced his will. He was a vulture in a tailored suit. "I have no business with Dorian West." Eliana lied, her heart thumping against her ribs like a trapped bird. Barrett Steele reached into the inner pocket of his duster and produced a folded sheaf of papers. He didn't step forward to hand them to her. He simply held them. "According to this loan agreement signed by one Thomas Brooks, you do. A debt of $2,000 taken out 18 months ago. The collateral is the deed to this land. Whispering Creek." Eliana's breath hitched. $2,000. It was an astronomical sum. Thomas had never told her the full amount. He had been a dreamer, her Thomas. He'd taken the loan to fund a new deep well drilling project, convinced a reliable water source would make their ranch thrive. But the drill had broken on unyielding rock, the hired rig had departed, and Thomas had died chasing a stray calf near that same treacherous rock face shortly after. All he'd left her with was heartbreak and a debt she couldn't possibly fathom repaying. The payments are 10 months in arrears, Barrett continued, his tone flat, devoid of malice or pity. It was simply a statement of fact. Mr. West's patience has expired. He's invoked the final clause. The debt is due in full, or the land is forfeit. Tears of fury and despair pricked at Eliana's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She would not show this man, this herald of her ruin, any weakness. There was a rockslide. My husband is dead. I've been trying to keep this place afloat on my own. I'm aware of your circumstances, Mrs. Brooks, he said, and for the first time a flicker of something unreadable crossed his face. Mr. West is not a man who concerns himself with circumstances, only ledgers. So, you're his dog then? She spat the words laced with venom. Come to chase a widow off her land so your master can feast on the scraps. Barrett's jaw tightened. He didn't rise to the insult. He just stood there, a granite statue in the oppressive heat, the papers still in his hand. My arrangement with Mr. West is my own. My business here is the debt. You have until sundown tomorrow to produce the $2,000. Eliana laughed, a harsh, broken sound. $2,000, I might as well try to lasso the moon. I have $17 in a tin box and a herd that wouldn't fetch 200 at market. You know it. West knows it. This is just a formality before you steal my home. She finally stepped out onto the porch, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She was a slight woman, but she stood as if she were 10 feet tall, her spine rigid with defiance. Well, you can tell Dorian West that he'll take this land over my dead body. This was my husband's dream. It's all I have left of him. Barrett Steele watched her, his expression unyielding. The silence stretched, filled only by the wind whistling through the eaves of the porch. He saw the desperation warring with pride in her fierce green eyes. He saw the fine tremors in her hands and the defiant set of her chin. He had seen this scene play out before. He knew what came next. The tears, the begging, and then the inevitable, soul-crushing acceptance of defeat. But as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and blood, he did something he had not planned. Something that defied every order he'd been given, and every instinct for self-preservation he possessed. He slowly folded the papers and tucked them back into his duster. There might be another way, he said, his voice so low she almost didn't hear it over the wind. Eliana stared at him, suspicious. I have nothing to sell, nothing to barter. That's not true, he said, his grey eyes locking onto hers. He took a single step closer, and the air crackled with a strange, unnerving energy. You have yourself. A cold dread washed over her. If you think... It's not what you think, he cut in sharply, a hint of steel in his voice. This is a business proposition, nothing more. He paused, as if weighing the sanity of his next words. Dorian West has a peculiar set of principles. He's a predator, but he operates by a twisted code. He won't move against the family of a man in his employ. Not directly. It's a matter of appearances for him. Eliana's mind reeled, unable to follow his logic. What are you saying? Barrett took a deep breath, the air whistling through his teeth. I'm saying you should marry me, Mrs. Brooks. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The wind died. The crickets fell silent. Eliana stared at him, convinced the heat had finally broken her mind. Of all the things she had expected, threats, violence, eviction, a marriage proposal was the last, the most insane, the most terrifying. You're mad, she whispered. I'm practical. He countered, his voice flat and even again. You marry me. We register the marriage certificate in Redemption Gulch. Your debt becomes my debt. As my wife, you fall under my protection, for lack of a better word. West will be forced to deal with me for the repayment. It buys you time. It keeps you on your land. She searched his face for any sign of a cruel joke of deception, but found only grim sincerity. His slate-grey eyes were deadly serious. And what do you get out of this? Arrangement, she asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and disbelief. "I get to settle a debt of my own," he said cryptically, his gaze turning distant. "A non-monetary one. Let's just say I have my own reasons for wanting to inconvenience Dorian West without openly defying him. This does that. So I would be your wife, in name only, in name and on paper." "Nothing more," he affirmed, his tone leaving no room for misunderstanding. "I'd sleep in the barn, I'd work the ranch alongside you, I'd contribute my wages from West towards the principal. We would be partners in a business transaction aimed at mutual survival. You keep your home, I settle my own score. When the debt is cleared, we go to the judge, we dissolve the union, and we walk away. No strings." Eliana looked from his unreadable face to the vast, empty expanse of her land. Whispering Creek. It was a poor name for a place where the wind never ceased its mournful howl, but it was hers. It held the ghost of her husband, the sweat of her own labor, the last ember of her hope. West would turn it into grazing land for his bloated herds, and its memory would be erased from the earth. This man, this stranger named Barrett Steele, was offering her a lifeline. It was a cold, strange, and terrifying lifeline, but it was the only one she had. To be bound to this grim-faced enforcer, to share her name with him, was a horrifying prospect. But to lose everything was a certainty she could not bear. "You have until sunrise to decide," Barrett said, turning to his horse. "I'll make camp by the creek. If you agree, have a pot of coffee on when I return in the morning. If you don't—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. He swung himself into the saddle. Without another word, he turned the buckskin and rode towards the trickle of water that gave the ranch its name, leaving Eliana Brooks alone on her porch, her world fractured, facing an impossible choice under a sky the color of a fresh bruise. Eliana did not sleep. The night was a long tormented vigil spent pacing the length of her small cabin. The Winchester felt heavy in her arms, a useless comfort against a threat that couldn't be shot. She alternately stoked the fire in the hearth and stared out the window into the oppressive darkness, where a small campfire glowed like a single malevolent eye down by the creek. Barrett Steele. The man was an enigma wrapped in dust and grim purpose. His proposal was an act of madness, a marriage of convenience to a man who worked for her greatest enemy. It was a devil's bargain, a contract signed in desperation. But what was the alternative? Riding away with $17 and a broken heart, leaving Thomas's grave to be trampled by West's cattle. Her husband's face swam in her memory, his easy smile, the boundless optimism in his eyes, even when things were at their worst. "This land has good bones, Eliana," he used to say. "We just need to give it a chance." Giving up now would be a betrayal of everything he had believed in, everything they had worked for. As the first pale fingers of dawn clawed at the eastern sky, Eliana made her decision. It wasn't a choice born of hope, but of pure stubborn defiance. She would not be broken. She would not run. With hands that felt disconnected from her body, she filled the coffee pot with water from the barrel, measured out the precious grounds, and set it on the hearth to boil. The act felt monumental, a surrender and a declaration of war all at once. Just as the sun crested the horizon, she heard the soft tread of his horse. She stood on the porch, a porcelain mug in her hand, her expression as hard and brittle as fired clay. Barrett Steele reined in his horse, his eyes immediately finding the plume of steam rising from the mug. He gave a single curt nod. The deal was struck. He dismounted and tied his buckskin to the rail. "There's a traveling preacher, Reverend Miles, in Redemption Gulch. He's a man of few questions, so long as the donation is fair. We ride now, we can have the certificate filed with the county clerk by noon." He spoke of their wedding as if it were a cattle drive schedule. Eliana simply nodded her throat, too tight for words. She went inside, put on her least-worn dress, a simple calico that had seen better days, and pinned up her hair. She looked at her reflection in the cracked mirror. The woman staring back was a stranger, her eyes wide with a fear she refused to name. When she emerged, Barrett was waiting with her mare already saddled. The ride to Redemption Gulch was silent and tense. The 15 miles felt like 100. They rode side by side, two strangers, bound by an invisible yet ironclad contract. The town was a dusty collection of clapboard buildings baking in the sun. Barrett led them straight to a small, dilapidated church at the edge of town. Reverend Miles was a portly man with sweat stains under his arms and eyes that gleamed with a mixture of piety and avarice. Barrett handed him $2 and the preacher's questions vanished. The ceremony was a 5-minute affair, a recitation of vows that felt like sacrilege. When the Reverend declared them man and wife, Barrett did not kiss her. He simply took her arm, his touch firm but impersonal, and led her to the clerk's office. The clerk, a gaunt man named Phineas Cobb, peered at them over his spectacles. He recognized Barrett as one of West's men and eyed Eliana with pitying curiosity. But the paperwork was in order, the signatures were made, and the state of Texas now recognized Eliana Brooks as Eliana Steele. The name felt foreign and wrong on her tongue. The ride back was just as silent, but the weight of what they had done hung between them heavier than the midday heat. When they reached the ranch, Barrett dismounted and immediately began unsaddling his horse. "I'll take the barn, as agreed," he stated, not looking at her. "I'll need a list of the most pressing chores. Fences that need mending, wells that are running low. I'll start at first light. The northern fence line along Coyote Ridge is down in 3 places," Eliana said, her voice a monotone. "And the well pump needs a new leather washer. I'll see to it." And just like that, their married life began. It was a strange, stilted dance of two people sharing a space, but not a life. Barrett was true to his word. He rose before dawn and worked until dusk, his energy seemingly limitless. He was brutally efficient. He repaired the northern fence line in a single day, his hammering echoing across the valley. He disassembled the well pump, fashioned a new washer from a piece of his own saddle leather, and had it drawing clear, cool water by evening. He moved with a quiet competence that was both impressive and unnerving. He never entered the house unless she called him for the sparse meals they shared in near total silence at opposite ends of the small kitchen table. He spoke only when necessary, his words clipped and practical. He slept in the hayloft of the barn, and she would sometimes see the flicker of his lantern through the cracks in the wood late into the night. Eliana found herself watching him. She watched the way the muscles in his back and shoulders strained as he dug new post holes. She watched his patient hands as he reshod her mare. He was a man of immense physical capability, yet he moved with a contained stillness, as if holding a powerful force in check. One evening, a week into their bizarre arrangement, a rider approached. Eliana's heart seized, but it wasn't West. It was one of his other men, a lean, wiry cowboy with cruel eyes and a sneer permanently etched on his face. His name was Caleb Thorne. Caleb reined in his horse, his eyes raking over Eliana with open insolence before settling on Barrett, who was sharpening an axe blade by the barn. "Steele, Caleb," called out his voice, a mocking drawl. "West's getting curious. Sent me to see if you'd run that widow off yet. He wants that deed." Barrett didn't stop his work. The rhythmic scrape of steel on steel was the only reply for a long moment. Then, without looking up, he said, "There's been a change of plans, Caleb." "A change of plans?" Caleb scoffed. "You don't make plans. West makes plans." Barrett finally set the axe down and rose to his full height. He wiped his hands on his trousers and turned to face Caleb, his expression impassive. "Mrs. Brooks and I were married last week. Her name is Mrs. Steele now. The debt is mine to manage." Caleb's jaw dropped. He stared from Barrett to Eliana, who stood, frozen on the porch, then back again. A slow, ugly grin spread across his face. "Well, I'll be." Barrett Steele, the lone wolf, got himself hitched to a piece of property. West is going to love this. He chuckled, a nasty grating sound. Playing house, are we? I wonder what other duties come with the arrangement. In a flash, Barrett closed the distance between them. He moved so fast, Caleb didn't have time to react. He didn't draw his gun. He simply grabbed the pommel of Caleb's saddle with one hand and the back of his belt with the other. With a surge of raw strength, he hauled the man bodily from the saddle and slammed him against the side of the barn. The wood groaned in protest. You will address my wife as Mrs. Steele. Barrett growled, his face inches from Caleb's, his slate-grey eyes burning with a cold fire. Eliana had never seen before. And you will never speak of her that way again. Do you understand me, Caleb? His face pale and his eyes wide with shock and fear. Could only manage a choked nod. The debt is being handled. Barrett continued, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. You can tell West. The first payment will be delivered on the 1st of the month. Now get off my land. He released Caleb, who scrambled to his feet, dusting himself off with trembling hands. He shot a look of pure hatred at Barrett, then scurried to his horse and galloped away, as if the devil himself were on his heels. Eliana stood on the porch, her heart hammering. He had called her his wife. He had defended her honor. It was part of the arrangement, she told herself. It was a necessary act to maintain the charade for West. But the ferocity of his defense, the raw protective fury in his eyes, felt like something more than a business transaction. That night, a thunderstorm rolled in a violent squall that shook the small cabin to its foundations. Rain lashed against the windows, and wind howled like a banshee. In the middle of the storm, a loud crack of lightning was followed by a panicked cry from the barn. It was her mare. Without thinking, Eliana grabbed a lantern and ran out into the deluge. The wind tore at her nightgown, and the rain soaked her to the bone in seconds. She slid open the heavy barn door to find Barrett already there, trying to calm the terrified horse. A piece of the roof had been torn away by the wind, and a heavy beam had splintered, crashing down near the mare's stall and spooking her badly. She's all right, Barrett shouted over the storm. Just spooked. He worked with the horse, his voice low and soothing, his hands firm but gentle on her neck, until her panicked whinnies subsided into nervous trembles. Eliana held the lantern high, its golden light cutting through the gloom, illuminating the scene. She saw the genuine concern on his face, the easy way he had with the animal. When the mare was calm, he turned to Eliana. She was drenched, shivering, her wet nightgown clinging to her form. For the first time, his professional mask seemed to slip. His gaze softened, and a flicker of something concern, maybe something else, warmed his eyes. You should go inside, he said, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't place. You'll catch your death. She just stood there, looking at him. The storm raging outside, and a different kind of storm brewing inside. This man, her stranger of a husband, had just defended her, calmed her horse, and was now looking at her as if she were something precious. Thank you, Barrett, she said, her voice barely a whisper. He simply nodded, his eyes holding hers for a moment longer than necessary. In that shared glance, amidst the chaos of the storm, the cold, hard lines of their contract began to blur, and the foundation of an uneasy, unspoken bond began to form. They were no longer just two strangers in a business deal. They were two people weathering the same storm under the same battered roof. The weeks following the storm settled into a new kind of rhythm. The awkward silence between Eliana and Barrett was gradually replaced by the comfortable quiet of shared labor. Words were still sparse, but they were no longer needed to communicate. A nod from him across the field meant the fence was secure. A fresh pail of milk left on the barn stoop was her way of acknowledging his hard day's work. They were a team, their movements synchronized by the demanding schedule of the ranch. Eliana found herself learning the man not through conversation, but through observation. She learned he preferred his coffee black and strong. She learned he had a long, healed-over scar that ran the length of his left forearm, which he never spoke of. She learned he had a quiet, surprising gentleness with the animals, especially a newborn calf that he'd helped her deliver during a difficult birth. Barrett, in turn, was learning Eliana. He saw her unwavering strength, the way she refused to bend to the harshness of the land. He saw her intelligence in the way she managed their meager supplies, making every bit of flour and every salted fish last. He saw the profound sadness that sometimes clouded her eyes when she thought he wasn't looking, a grief for her late husband that was as vast and empty as the plains around them. One sweltering afternoon, while they were reinforcing the small dam at the creek, the foundation of their silent partnership was tested. Eliana, wrestling a large rock into place, lost her footing on the slick bank. She cried out as her ankle twisted, sending a jolt of white-hot pain up her leg. Before she even hit the water, Barrett was there. He moved with the same startling speed he'd used on Caleb Thorne, catching her and pulling her back to the bank. "I'm all right," she gasped, trying to stand, but the pain was too sharp. Her ankle was already beginning to swell. "No, you're not," he said, his voice firm, leaving no room for argument. Without a word of permission, he gently scooped her into his arms. Eliana's breath caught in her throat. She was acutely aware of the strength in his arms, the solidness of his chest against her back, the faint scent of leather and dry earth that clung to him. He carried her back to the cabin as if she weighed nothing at all. He set her down gently on her bed, his movements careful and deliberate. "Stay put. I'll fetch some cold water and bandages." He worked with a surprising tenderness, his large calloused hands probing her ankle with a practiced touch. "It's a bad sprain, but I don't think it's broken." He diagnosed, his voice low. "You need to stay off it for a few days." "The ranch won't run itself," she protested weakly. "I'll handle it," he said simply. And he did. For the next 3 days, Barrett did the work of 2 people. He managed the cattle, repaired the dam, tended the small vegetable patch, and still found time to check on her. He would bring her meals, simple affairs of beans and jerky, but prepared and brought to her bedside. He would refill her water pitcher without being asked. On the 3rd evening, as he brought her a plate of food, the silence between them finally broke. "You're a good nurse," Eliana said quietly, looking at him as he stood awkwardly in the doorway of her room. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his mouth. "I've had some practice patching things up." He gestured to the scar on his forearm. "Mostly on myself." She seized the opening. "How did you get that?" He hesitated, his gaze turning distant. For a moment she thought he would deflect as he always did. But then he sighed a sound of profound weariness and leaned against the doorframe. "Comanche raid about 10 years back," he said, his voice flat. "I was with the Rangers then. We were tracking a group that had hit a settlement near the Llano Estacado. They ambushed us in a canyon. It was bad. I was younger, greener, and dumber than I should have been, Yidin." Eliana listened, captivated. It was the most he had ever said about his past. "You were a Texas Ranger." He nodded, for a time. "I saw enough to last a man several lifetimes. When you spend your days tracking the worst in people, it starts to rub off on you, or you get tired of seeing good people pay the price." I left, and then, she prompted, gently. His expression darkened. "And then I drifted. Took odd jobs. Got into a bad spot down near Laredo. A card game that went south. I was outnumbered and out of luck. A man stepped in. Saved my skin. That man was Dorian West." The name fell into the quiet room like a steel. "He didn't do it out of kindness." Barrett continued, his voice laced with self-loathing. "West doesn't know the meaning of the word. He saw a man with a useful set of skills, a man who was good with a gun and wasn't afraid of a fight. And he saw a man who now owed him a life debt. He's been collecting on it ever since, sending me to do his dirty work, like coming here." The confession hung in the air between them, raw and honest. Eliana finally understood. The arrangement, the marriage, it wasn't just about inconveniencing West. It was an act of rebellion. It was Barrett's way of balancing the ledger of his own soul, of using the skills West prized to protect an innocent person instead of persecuting one. And my husband, Eliana asked, her voice trembling. Thomas Biggie, he took that loan. He was so hopeful. He never would have. He didn't understand men like West. No, Barrett agreed softly. He didn't. Your husband was a good man from what I gather. He just made a deal with the devil. Tears welled in Eliana's eyes. Tears for her foolish, wonderful Thomas, and tears for this complicated, wounded man standing in her doorway. He loved this land so much. She whispered mostly to herself. He said it had secrets. Good secrets. He was always looking, tapping the rock formations, studying the old survey maps. He was convinced there was more here than just a creek. Barrett's brow furrowed. Secrets. What kind of secrets? I don't know, she admitted, wiping a tear from her cheek. He was killed before he could ever tell me. The rock slide. It happened right over there. She pointed through the window towards a jagged cliff face at the far end of the property, a place she never went near, the place he was always studying. A strange look crossed Barrett's face, a flicker of the ranger he once was. An analytical, calculating glint appeared in his grey eyes. A rock slide, at the exact spot a man was investigating, with a debt to Dorian West hanging over his head. Eliana. He said, his voice now sharp with a new intensity. Did your husband keep a journal? Any notes? Did he have any of those old maps you mentioned? The shift in his tone startled her. Yes. He had a lockbox, full of his papers. It's under the bed. Barrett pushed off the doorframe and crossed the room in 2 strides. He knelt, pulled out a dusty metal box and placed it on the bed. The key. She pointed to a small, tarnished key on a leather thong hanging from a nail on the wall. He retrieved it, unlocked the box, and lifted the lid. Inside was a collection of yellowed papers, hand-drawn sketches of rock strata, and several old rolled-up survey maps. Barrett carefully lifted them out his hands, which had been so gentle on her ankle, now moving with focused urgency. He unrolled one of the maps, a territorial survey from the 1850s. His finger traced the lines, his eyes scanning the faded ink. He compared it to one of Thomas's sketches. His breath caught. My God, he whispered. What is it? Eliana asked, leaning forward, her sprained ankle forgotten. He pointed to a specific notation on the old map, a mark almost lost in the faded ink. It designated a small seasonal spring. Then he pointed to a corresponding mark on Thomas's sketch, next to which Thomas had scrawled a note. Spring isn't here. Line is off. Survey marker JB17 must be moved. Follow the line west. What does that mean? Eliana asked. Barrett looked up from the map, his eyes burning with a terrible dawning realization. It means the official survey line for this entire region might be wrong. This creek, Whispering Creek, it's not just a creek, Eliana. It's a legal boundary line. If that original survey marker was moved even 100 yards, it would change everything. He looked at her, the pieces clicking into place with grim certainty. It would mean the land West's ranch sits on. The water rights he claims to own. None of it is legally his. His entire empire is built on a fraudulent claim. He looked towards the window at the distant, ominous cliff face. And your husband found out. I don't think that rock slide was an accident, Eliana. I think Thomas Brooks was murdered to protect that secret. The truth, when it came, was colder and more terrifying than any debt. Their sham marriage, their fragile alliance, had just unearthed a conspiracy that could get them both killed. The debt was no longer the issue. Their very lives were now the collateral. The discovery in Thomas's lockbox changed everything. The cabin, once a shelter, now felt like a cairn. The secret it held was a living thing, breathing a toxic fear into the air. The ranch was no longer just a struggling homestead. It was the epicenter of a dangerous truth, and West's shadow loomed larger and darker than ever before. He can't know that we know, Barrett said, his voice a low, urgent whisper, as he carefully rolled the maps and placed them back in the box. He slid it deep under the bed. Not yet. Not until we have proof. The proof is the marker, Eliana stated, her mind racing. The pain in her ankle was a dull throb compared to the sharp terror in her heart. Thomas wrote, "Survey marker JB17 must be moved. If we can find the original spot or prove the current one is fake, West will have it watched." Barrett countered, pacing the small room like a caged wolf. "If he killed your husband to hide it, he won't leave it unguarded. He's been patient, letting the debt be the reason to take this land. He wanted it to look legal. But if he gets a whiff of what we're onto, he'll stop playing games. He'll send more than just Caleb Thorne." A cold pragmatism settled over Eliana. The grief for Thomas was still a raw wound, but now it was forged with a steely resolve. "Then we have to be smarter than him." For the next week, they lived a lie within a lie. To any outside observer, they were the strange, newly married couple working the land. Barrett continued his relentless labor, and Eliana, once her ankle was strong enough to bear weight, worked alongside him. But now their work had a dual purpose. While mending fences on the western edge of the property, they were secretly scouting the terrain, looking for any sign of West's men near the cliffs. While clearing brush by the creek, they were examining the flow of the water, comparing it to Thomas's hand-drawn maps. Their conversations, held in hushed tones after dark, were no longer about chores but about strategy. The shared danger dissolved the last of the barriers between them. One night, sitting at the kitchen table with only a single lamp burning, Eliana found herself tracing the scar on his forearm with her eyes. "You said you left the Rangers because you were tired of seeing good people pay the price," she said softly. "Is that why you proposed this arrangement?" Barrett stopped cleaning his pistol, his hands going still. He looked at her, his grey eyes holding a depth of emotion she had never seen before. "When I rode up to this porch, I saw the same look in your eyes that I've seen in a dozen other homesteaders, right before West crushed them. Defiant, proud, but cornered. For years, I'd been the tool of that crushing, the hammer that fell. I told myself it was just a job, a debt I was repaying. But looking at you, standing there ready to fight for this pile of dirt and timbers with your last breath, I couldn't do it. I couldn't be the hammer, not again." He looked down at his own hands. "This marriage. It was a selfish act, Eliana. It was for me. A way to finally push back, to do one right thing, to balance out 100 wrong ones. I never intended for you to be in this kind of danger." "It's not your fault, Barrett," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She reached across the table and for the first time touched him. Her fingers gently rested on the back of his hand. It was a simple, fleeting gesture, but it sent a shockwave through the room. His hand was warm and solid under hers. He didn't pull away. "Thomas's fight is my fight," she said, her gaze unwavering. "And now it's our fight." The hour hung in the air, a word of profound significance. They were no longer partners in a transaction. They were allies bound by a shared secret and a growing unspoken affection. Their chance came unexpectedly. A dust storm, a true Texas screamer, was forecast to roll in. It was the perfect cover. "No one will be watching the cliffs in that," Barrett said, studying the bruised-looking sky. "Not even West's men are that dedicated. It's our chance to find that marker." As the sky turned a sickly yellow and the wind began to howl, they rode out, not towards town, but towards the jagged rock face where Thomas had met his end. They tethered their horses in a sheltered arroyo and proceeded on foot, the wind tearing at them, pelting them with sand that stung like needles. Following the notes in Thomas's journal, they navigated the treacherous terrain. It was Eliana who spotted it first. Tucked behind a thick growth of mesquite, almost completely buried by time and debris, was a heavy iron stake driven deep into the ground. On its weathered top was a faint, rusted inscription, JB17. "This is it," Barrett breathed, his voice nearly snatched away by the wind. He knelt, clearing away the dirt. The original marker. It's a good 200 yards east of where the current county map says it is. So the official line is wrong, Eliana said, a triumphant, fearful thrill running through her. It's not just wrong, Barrett said grimly. It was deliberately falsified. Look. He pointed to the base of the stake. The earth around it was hard-packed, undisturbed for decades. Then he pointed west towards the cliffs. The new marker, the one on the official maps, would have been placed up there. In loose shale. Easy to move, easy to fake. He stood up, his face a mask of cold fury. This stake proves West's primary cattle grazing land, his mainline camp, and more importantly, the headwaters of the San Pedro River, which he dammed up and sells water rights from, are all on what should be public territory or part of neighboring ranches he's already squeezed out. But their triumph was short-lived. As the storm reached its peak, a third figure emerged from the swirling dust like an apparition. He was leading a horse, his face covered by a bandana, a rifle held at the ready. It was Dorian West himself. He hadn't sent his dogs. He had come himself. And with him were Caleb Thorne and another hard-faced rider. I had a feeling you two were getting clever. West's voice boomed over the wind. He was a large, imposing man, dressed in a fine black duster that whipped around him like a vulture's wings. His face was weathered, but his eyes were sharp and intelligent, burning with cold fire. I paid a man at the clerk's office to keep an eye on any interesting partnerships. When my man Thorne told me about the wedding, I knew Steele was up to something. I just couldn't figure out what. He gestured with his rifle towards the marker. But when I heard about the poor deceased Mr. Brooks's little hobby of geology, it all clicked. He got too close to the truth. Just like you. Caleb Thorne grinned, his ugly smile visible even in the storm. Told you he was playing house for a reason, boss. It's over, West, Barrett said, stepping in front of Eliana, shielding her with his body. His hand hovered over the Colt at his hip. We know everything. Oh, I think it's just beginning, West sneered. You see, the beauty of this storm is its noise. It will cover all sorts of sounds. Another tragic rockslide, perhaps. This time claiming the lives of a desperate widow and the fool who tried to save her. A terrible accident. I'll even put up a plaque in their memory after I legally acquire the land to settle their outstanding debt. His eyes, cold and merciless, met Barrett's. You should have stayed a hammer, Steele. You were good at it. It's a shame you tried to grow a heart. It's made you weak. Is that what you think? Barrett replied, his voice dangerously quiet. In that moment, Eliana knew. The contract was void. The pretense was gone. This wasn't about debt or convenience anymore. Barrett had made his final choice. He had chosen her. He had chosen to stand against the man he owed his life to, for the woman who had become his life. The wind howled, whipping sand and fury around the five figures locked in a deadly standoff. The unbreakable bond they had forged in silence and shared labor was about to be tested by fire and lead. The world narrowed to the space between the five of them, a pocket of lethal stillness in the heart of the storm. Dorian West's confidence was a palpable force, the arrogance of a man who believed he owned the world and everyone in it. You have two choices. Steele West's voice cut through the wind. Hand over the woman and walk away, and I'll forget the life debt you owe me. Or die here with her. Your choice. Barrett didn't answer with words. His eyes fixed on West conveyed his decision with chilling clarity. He was not walking away. Eliana's heart pounded against her ribs. She was not a bystander in this. This was her land, her fight. While West's attention was fixed on Barrett, she subtly shifted her weight, her eyes darting around the rocky terrain she knew so well. She remembered the loose shale, the treacherous footing that had been part of Thomas's undoing. You always were a sentimental fool, Barrett West spat, raising his rifle. A stray dog I should have put down years ago. That was the moment Barrett moved. It wasn't the quick draw of a saloon showman. It was the explosive, economical motion of a ranger. His Colt was in his hand and firing before Caleb Thorne or the other man could even fully register his intent. The first shot wasn't aimed at a man, but at the rock face just above Caleb's head. The bullet struck the weathered shale, and as Barrett had intended, it didn't just chip the rock, it shattered it. A cascade of loose steels and dust rained down, causing Caleb to cry out and stumble backward, his own shot going wild. It was the opening they needed. "Eliana, run!" Barrett yelled, diving behind a large boulder, as West's rifle roared the bullet sparking off the rock where he had just been standing. But Eliana didn't run away. She ran sideways, scrambling up the very shale slope that Barrett's shot had destabilized. She knew this ground. She knew its weaknesses. The ridge, she screamed, her voice shrill against the storm. The overhang, Barrett understood immediately. He laid down, suppressing fire. His shots precise and controlled, forcing West and his remaining man to take cover. He wasn't trying to kill them, not yet. He was trying to buy her time. Caleb Thorne, recovering his nerve, saw Eliana scrambling up the slope and saw her as the easier target. He raised his pistol, a cruel grin on his face. "Nowhere to run, little lady." He never fired the shot. A bullet from Barrett's Colt struck him square in the shoulder. He screamed, dropping his gun and clutching the wound, his face a mask of agony and surprise. Meanwhile, Eliana reached a gnarled, dead juniper tree, growing precariously from the side of the cliff just below a large, unstable rock overhang the very formation Thomas had been studying. Using all her strength, she began to push and wrench at the tree's root ball, which was embedded in the fractured rock. The land itself was her weapon. West saw what she was doing. His face contorted in a mask of fury. This wasn't going according to his clean, simple plan. He roared in frustration and fired at Eliana, but his shot was rushed. The bullet whizzed past her ear, close enough for her to feel its heat. Barrett used that moment. He burst from behind his cover, not at West, but at his last remaining man. He moved with a brutal efficiency, closing the distance and disarming the man with a powerful blow to the wrist before slamming the barrel of his Colt against the man's temple. The thug crumpled to the ground unconscious. Now it was just two men, Barrett Steele and Dorian West. "The enforcer and the master." "You miserable worm," West bellowed, turning his rifle on Barrett. But it was too late. With a final desperate heave, Eliana dislodged the root ball of the juniper. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The key steel of the unstable overhang was gone. With a deep groaning crack that was louder than the storm tons of rock and shale began to slide. Barrett Eliana screamed. He didn't need telling. He was already sprinting away from the cliff face towards open ground. West, caught between his desire to shoot Barrett and the instinct for self-preservation, hesitated for a fatal second. He turned to run, but the ground beneath him was already giving way. The rock slide was a terrifying spectacle of nature's power. It wasn't a single sheet of rock, but a churning river of steel and earth that roared down the slope. It swept over the spot where West stood, burying him, not in a clean avalanche, but in a chaotic, grinding torrent. It buried the falsified survey marker. It buried the lie. When the dust began to settle, there was an eerie silence, the roar of the slide momentarily eclipsing the howl of the storm. Barrett stood, breathing heavily, his chest heaving. He looked at the mountain of fresh rock and dirt. Then, his eyes frantically searched for Eliana. She was safe, perched on a stable ledge above the devastation, her face pale, but her eyes blazing with fierce life. Their gazes met across the newly scarred landscape. Slowly, carefully, she made her way down to him. The storm was beginning to abate, the wind softening its scream to a mournful sigh. They stood together looking at the fresh grave of the man who had tormented them both. Caleb Thorne was moaning on the ground, clutching his shoulder, no longer a threat. The other man was still unconscious. The debt was paid, not in coin, but in blood and dust. Barrett turned to Eliana. His face streaked with grime, his eyes filled with a raw, overwhelming emotion. He reached out and gently cupped her face, his thumb stroking her cheek, as if to assure himself she was real. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice thick. "No," she whispered, leaning into his touch. Thanks to you. No, he corrected her softly. Thanks to us. You saved us, Eliana. You used his own land against him. In the quiet aftermath of the battle with the sky beginning to clear, the pretense of their arrangement lay shattered around them like the rocks on the cliffside. There was no contract. There was no business transaction. There was only the man and the woman who had faced death together and won. He looked at the woman who had met his cold proposal with fiery defiance, who had worked beside him, trusted him, and ultimately fought beside him. The woman he had married to settle a score, but had somehow impossibly come to love. The debt to West is finished, he said, his voice low and serious. The legal agreement we made, the one that says we can dissolve this union, we can still do that. I'll testify on your behalf. With West gone and the original marker found, this land is yours free and clear. You would be free. Eliana looked up at him, at the steadfast honesty in his slate-grey eyes. She thought of the lonely nights before he came, the silent meals, the life devoid of partnership. Then she thought of the quiet competence, the fierce protection, the shared danger, and the touch of his hand on hers. She smiled, a true, radiant smile that felt as if it could make the desert bloom. I am free, Barrett, she said, but I don't want to be, not from you. She took his hand in hers, their fingers lacing together perfectly. Our contract was for a marriage in name only, but I find myself wanting to renegotiate the terms. A slow smile, the first genuine unguarded smile she had ever seen from him, spread across Barrett's face. It transformed his rugged features, chasing away the shadows of his past. He drew her closer until their bodies were pressed together, two halves of a whole. I accept those terms, Mrs. Steele, he murmured, and then he bent his head and kissed her. It wasn't a kiss of passion born in a moment, but a kiss of deep, profound connection forged in hardship. It was a promise of shared sunrises, of a home built not just of wood and steel, but of mutual respect, unyielding courage, and a love as real and enduring as the Texas land itself. They had started with a debt, but what they found was a treasure beyond any price, an unbreakable bond. And so on the land they won together, the story of Barrett and Eliana Steele truly began. Their tale proves that the greatest legends of the West were written not always with guns, but with courage, resilience, and an unlikely love that could blossom in the harshest of lands. If this story of grit and unbreakable bonds resonated with you, please show your support with a like and a share. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell so you don't miss the next tale from the frontier. Thank you for listening.